My name is Sally Grapin, and I am an assistant professor at Montclair State University in school psychology specifically. And I'm really honored to have a chance to speak to students of Division 45 today. I really love having an opportunity to mentor students in general and just interact with them. And so I hope this presentation today is helpful to you. Okay, so I'll just start off by providing a little bit of background about me. I do like to share a little bit about my background just in case students have questions or they're interested in similar career paths, and there's something that you think I can be helpful to you in terms of talking about in terms of career pathways. So I received my PhD in school psychology from the University of Florida in 2014. And then immediately after, I became an assistant professor of psychology at Montclair State. And so specifically, I'm trained in the field of school psychology. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist and also a state certified school psychologist. And I'm license eligible, although I haven't pursued the postdoctoral training hours necessary for licensure yet. I teach a variety of graduate and undergraduate courses in school psychology, and in particular, my research interests center on social justice advocacy, reading assessment and intervention, and the implementation of multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, which is essentially a school-wide model for supporting positive academic outcomes for students. Okay, so the first question you might ask is, why is it important to learn about the field of school psychology? First, I'd just like to provide you with some basic information and some basic statistics. Essentially, because we have compulsory schooling laws in the United States, school mental health professionals really have a lot of opportunity to interact with students. And essentially, we have access to all students or all children at some point in their lives. What's surprising to some people is that 70% of youth who receive mental health services actually receive them from school-based providers, and so oftentimes school psychologists. Because so many students are receiving school psychological services, professional psychologists from all types of backgrounds really often have opportunities to collaborate with school psychologists and to work with them to coordinate really comprehensive service delivery. So it is important to be aware of the work of school psychologists and the types of services they are providing to students. Okay, so I'll give you also a little bit of overview of my talk today. So the intended audience really for this talk is basically undergraduates who are interested in pursuing a degree in school psychology. I hope it'll be helpful to you in understanding exactly what school psychologist does. I also hope this talk will be helpful for graduate students who are interested in potentially respecializing, or graduate students who are in some type of profession in which they could really see themselves eventually collaborating with school psychologists, or having an opportunity to coordinate service delivery with school psychologists. So it really is kind of a broad audience that I'm hoping that this presentation will be helpful for. In particular, I hope to answer several questions. So what is school psychology, and to tell you a little bit about the profession itself. Who are today's school psychologists? What types of training do school psychologists receive? If it's relevant to you and you're an undergraduate student or someone looking to respecialize, I'm going to answer the question of how can I gain acceptance to a school psychology program? And then in particular, what are the various career options in school psychology, and how can I be successful in pursuing a career in this field in particular? Okay, so first I'll talk a little bit about who school psychologists are and what they do. So the National Association of School Psychologists, in addition to Division 16 of the APA, are organizations that represent the interests of school psychologists. And so if you look on NASP's website, and you would see a similar description on APA Division 16's website as well, but you can see that school psychologists are uniquely qualified individuals who apply expertise in mental health, learning, and behavior to help children and youth succeed academically, socially, behaviorally, and emotionally. So school psychologists really have a big job in the sense that they are supporting students in a variety of domains of functioning. They're collaborating with lots of other types of professionals including social workers, outside providers, teachers, school administrators, all really for this broad purpose to support student success in the school environment, whether that be in the academic, social, or emotional domains. So I also just want to talk a little bit about, before I jump into the specific roles and functions of school psychologists, I want to talk about some common myths about school psychologists. First, one of the things I often hear from students when they're considering different career options is they'll say things like, Well, school psychologists must hold a doctoral degree in order to practice. And so I'll talk about a little bit about that in a few slides about how we actually have a pretty diverse group in terms of their training backgrounds. And some school psychologists are practicing at the doctoral level, whereas some are actually practicing at the non-doctoral level. Another thing I typically hear is that school psychologists can only be employed in schools. And the truth is they are primarily employed in schools. In fact, the majority of school psychologists work in a K-12 district. However, we see school psychologists really working in a variety of settings. And so again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Sometimes I hear people say school psychologists, for example, are only engaged in assessment activities, and assessment is really only a small part of what school psychologists do and what they're trained to do. They're actually very heavily involved in counseling, systems-wide intervention, consultation, and a variety of other services. And then sometimes I'll hear as well, school psychologists only work with youth with special needs. School psychologists are really trained to work with youth from a variety of backgrounds, often focusing specifically on K-12 youth, but we also work with college students as well. And in some cases, school psychologists work with adults. Okay, so what do school psychologists do? We have many different functions in the school, and I'm just going to clarify just a few of them for you right now. One thing that we do is we work to help students improve academic achievement. So in particular, we promote student engagement, we conduct a variety of types of academic assessments, and then we help teachers also individualize instruction and intervention such that we can achieve what we call instructional match, meaning that the students' skills are appropriately matched to the interventions that they're receiving. So we really are experts in the actual learning process and then in supporting students in obtaining or really succeeding academically. We also promote positive behavior and mental health. So we're well versed in the social skills that students need to acquire over the course of their schooling. We're competent in assessing emotional and behavioral needs, and then providing individualized and group-based counseling services and a variety of other interventions to essentially help promote positive mental health outcomes. We support diverse learners, so we're qualified to assess diverse learning needs, provide culturally competent services to students and families from diverse backgrounds. We also do, in many cases, work with students with disabilities, and we help to assist in designing programs that are able to support their diverse learning needs. We create safe, positive school climates. So in particular, we engage in bullying prevention programming, violence prevention programming. We help to administrators and teachers to think about school climate and essentially how we can improve the climate of schools such that students feel that their schools are safe and welcoming. We engage in crisis prevention and a variety of intervention services in this domain too. We focus a lot on strengthening family-school partnerships. So in particular, we help families understand children's learning and mental health needs. We help them navigate essentially the special education process as appropriate, and essentially help families and parents feel engaged in the academic lives of their students. And then finally, we improve school-wide assessment and accountability. So in particular, we can help monitor individual student progress, both in academics and in behavior. And then we help schools essentially understand school-wide data in terms of how their students are doing academically, and then how their students are doing in a variety of other non-academic domains as well. So these are just kind of just a brief overview, essentially, of some of the roles and functions of school psychologists. But as a general rule, we're trained pretty broadly in a variety of service types. Okay, so who do school psychologists serve? Mostly, we generally serve children between the ages of 3 and 21, although again, in some cases, we do serve adult populations beyond 21 years. We serve families, teachers, administrators, community providers, and a variety of other individuals as well who are in the schools who are looking essentially to improve their service delivery. So one common question that I often get from students is, how are school psychologists different from child clinical psychologists or just child psychologists in general? And the truth is there really is a lot of overlap in the roles and functions of school psychologists and clinical psychologists, but there are also several ways in which they're different. So I can start out by talking about the similarities between the professions, which are that both child clinical psychologists and school psychologists have strong backgrounds in child development and psychology. So we take very similar types of coursework in that sense. We both engage in direct interventions to promote mental health. Okay. But some of the differences have to do with the employment settings that we're typically involved with and then the services we provide. So whereas child clinical psychologists generally tend to have a greater emphasis on psychopathology and long-term therapy, school psychologists really focus on things like school organization, instruction, classroom management, and a more broad range of student services. Child clinical psychologists are typically found in hospitals, mental health centers, and then private clinic settings, whereas the majority of school psychologists are found in K-12 settings. Like I said, they also work in hospitals and mental health clinics in many cases, but the majority will be found in those primary and secondary school settings. School psychologists are generally more likely to work with teachers and parents to improve instruction in the classroom. Whereas child psychologists really do work with families to a large extent, but they have a greater emphasis on direct interventions and less on assessment than the school psychologists. Okay, so who are today's school psychologists? So every 5 years, the National Association of School Psychologists conducts a membership survey. And this membership survey gives us a lot of information about the demographics of school psychologists, as well as what types of activities these school psychologists are engaged in. And so what I have up here on this slide is essentially demographic results from the National Association membership survey, starting in 1980 and then ending with the most recent survey results in 2014 through 2015. And what you can see here is that right now, school psychology is predominantly a white and Caucasian field. Over time, there have been many efforts by NASP and Division 16 essentially to diversify the population within school psychology, and we've recognized it as a critical problem. But it's something that as a field we're continuing to work on. What the National Association of School Psychologists in Division 16 has undertaken is initiatives that essentially help convey the importance of recruiting diverse psychologists into the profession, and then also the importance of having a diverse range of talents represented as well. So it's something that school psychology as a profession has really thought a lot about, and is really taking measures essentially to diversify the field. In contrast, what we see is that the K-12 student population is much more diverse than our current school psychology workforce. And what you'll see from looking at this chart is that we have racial and ethnic demographics in 2001, and the black bar is 2011, and then that light blue bar is projections for 2023. And as you can see, the K-12 population is diversifying much more quickly than our school psychology workforce, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I show you this next slide, which tells us a little bit about the linguistic backgrounds of school psychologists. As you can see, 86% of school psychologists, at least those surveyed in this national sample, spoke English only, and a very relatively smaller percentage spoke languages other than English, including Spanish and American Sign Language, and 27 other different languages. In contrast, again, we see that the K-12 student population is much more diverse than our school psychology workforce. And in particular, we have a large number of students who speak Spanish, some who speak Chinese and French and German. And as a general rule, we see that a much larger number of languages are represented among our K-12 population than they are among our school psychologists. All around, these statistics are really, really troubling to see, partly because we see that school psychologists may not necessarily be prepared essentially to serve the diverse population that they're encountering in terms of being able to conduct multilingual and bilingual assessments, and essentially being able to recognize the needs and the challenges that students from diverse backgrounds sometimes can face in our K-12 school environments. And so again, this is something that the profession of school psychology has really spent a lot of time thinking about how we can increase diversity among our working professionals. Okay. One question that I often get from students is, what is the job market like in school psychology? And the truth is, right now, the job market is really we have a very good outlook on it now, in terms that school psychology is really a great field to go into. Um, Castillo, Curtis, and Tan in 2014 published a really excellent article essentially looking at the number of school psychologists we actually have available and then projecting the number of school psychologists we would actually need. And what we found over time is that we have persistent national shortages in the number of school psychologists represented in the United States. And so what you can see here is I have the regions listed out, and then I have numbers of school psychologists, and then the percentage either deficit or surplus we're expecting to see in 2025, and then I also have it listed for 2015 as well. And what you can see is that across regions, generally, we have somewhere between a 2 to 4% deficit in the number of school psychologists that we actually need across regions. You'll see that in some regions, for example, the Mid-Atlantic in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, we have a slight surplus in terms of our school psychologists. But as a general rule, we're lacking between 2 to 4% of school psychologists. And that deficit isn't anticipated to get better, essentially, over time. But unfortunately, school psychology is still going to be a real area of need in terms of recruiting new professionals into the field. And so in many areas of the country, it really is an excellent profession to go into in terms of job opportunities and prospects. Just a little bit more about demographics of current school psychologists. So the majority are women, and we have a smaller percentage, about 17%, who identify as men. Again, this is fairly consistent with demographics that we'll see across many psychology disciplines, but the field of school psychology is always looking to recruit more men into the profession. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the training of school psychologists and the pathways that they can pursue in order to become certified professionals. So as I mentioned earlier, not all school psychologists are trained at the doctoral level. In fact, many, or the majority, are actually trained at the non-doctoral level. So approximately 75% of practicing school psychologists practice with degrees such as educational specialist, or EDS, or specialist in psychology, PSY-S. These programs generally require about 60 credits total, with usually including a 6-credit or approximately 6-credit internship. And they generally involve a minimum of 3 years of full-time study with 2 years of full-time coursework. And then that last third year is usually a 1,200-hour internship. Now, in order to qualify or to be certified as a school psychologist in most states, that 1,200-hour internship must have at least 600 hours in a school environment, although many individuals choose to do the remaining 600 hours in different types of mental health settings. Now, at the doctoral level, these degrees are titles that you may be more familiar with. So, for example, the Doctor of Philosophy, PhD, or the Doctor of Psychology, PsyD. So about 25% of our school psychologists across the US hold these doctoral level degrees. So these degrees are generally about 4 years of full-time coursework with a 1,500-hour internship and a minimum of 600 hours in the schools. Now, individuals who pursue this route, just so you know, generally are license eligible, meaning that upon securing postdoctoral training and a passing score on what we call the EPPP examination, these individuals are qualified and ready, essentially, to become licensed psychologists in the states in which they work in. So they would be qualified to work in settings other than schools, and in particular in private practice. So common specialty areas in school psychology. Obviously, all school psychologists are competent in working with K-12 youth. And we have very broad training in terms of the services that we're able to provide, but many school psychologists have specific specialty areas. I've listed just a few of these, and you'll notice that some of them are common to other disciplines. So for example, clinical psychology and counseling psychology, but it is very common for school psychologists to work in these areas as well. So for example, many school psychologists are specifically trained in school neuropsychology, bilingual assessment and intervention, working with children with autism spectrum disorders, looking at executive functioning, and then implementing ABA, or applied behavioral analysis. And so there really are many opportunities for individuals who pursue a degree in school psychology to specialize in a number of these areas. Okay. I have a brief section here talking a little bit about applying to school psychology programs. And so for undergraduate students who are interested now in going on to graduate school in school psychology, this section might be really useful for you, as well as for any graduate students who are considering respecializing or pursuing a school psychology certification on top of a different type of related degree. So, like many other graduate programs, there are a number of steps to applying to these programs. And in particular, I'll just walk you through some of the basic steps. The first would be, of course, to select your programs. And this is going to depend largely on whether you're pursuing the non-doctoral route or the doctoral level route. And it will also depend on the types of settings that you're interested in working in terms of different regions of the country, as well as the areas of specialization represented in that program. After identifying admissions requirements, most school psychology programs require students to complete the graduate record exam, or the GRE, to develop a personal statement and CV, to secure letters of recommendation. And as a general rule, I would recommend that you give your letter writers at least 3 months lead time to be able to develop a high quality letter for you and to make sure that that letter is submitted on time. Application submission generally takes place between November and January, specifically for doctoral programs often. The applicants often complete an in-person interview. I know of very few programs really that don't require students to come for either some type of Skype or in-person interview in around January to February. And then students receive program offers in the spring and then have to typically accept an offer from one program if they choose by April 15th. So I just wanted to make you aware of some resources that might help you identify school psychology programs that are a good fit for you. So the National Association of School Psychologists has tried to put together a graduate program database that can be found on their website, which is on the slide, nasponline.org. And what this database does essentially is list out the programs and then list out contact information, as well as other types of relevant information you might want to see. So for example, student enrollment data, degrees offered, the status of NASP and APA accreditation will be listed on there as well. And all of these pieces of information are really important to pay attention to when looking for a program that essentially is going to be a good fit for you, and of course going to lead to the professional outcomes that you'd like to see. So for example, securing licensure and securing certification. So again, this can be found on nasponline.org, and it really is an excellent resource. It lists all of the programs by state, so it makes it easier for you to look across regions for particular programs. One part of developing an application for a school psychology program is coming up with a resume or a CV as well. I have worked with many undergraduate students in the past in terms of CV development, and what I find most often is that students tend to, I guess, underrepresent essentially all of the wonderful things that they've really done, in the sense that they tend to leave many things off their CV that I think a school psychology graduate program, or really any other graduate program in psychology, might be interested in. And so I often ask my students these questions in particular because these are the types of experiences that tend to get left off the CV but should be on the CV. So in particular, I might ask, have you ever completed an independent study with a professor or instructor? Because if you have, especially if it's been focused on research, it might be something relevant to list on the CV. Have you ever received funding to attend a school to attend a conference, really any other type of professional development opportunity? Because again, that might be something to list. Have you ever published an article in your school's newsletter, whether or not it's related to psychology or not related to psychology? Because that shows that you do have some writing experience and have had opportunities to publish your work. Have you worked with children in any type of professional setting? And it doesn't necessarily need to be a school. It can be in a daycare setting, an after-school setting, whatever type of experience it might be. I often ask my students, have you ever attended a conference or completed any type of professional development that might be relevant? That might be something to list on the CV as well. And have you ever delivered a professional presentation, whether it's inside or outside of your intended field of study? Again, these are the things I think that students tend to commonly leave off their undergraduate CVs, but are the kinds of things that a school psychology program might be interested in seeing. I also wanted to point out this program too, because I think it's an excellent resource, particularly for individuals who decide they want to go into school psychology programs, but have made the decision a little bit later on in the process. So the National Association of School Psychologists offers something called a second round candidate match, which essentially allows students who either were not accepted to school psychology programs during the regular application period, or for students who decided that they became interested in school psychology programs after the deadlines had passed. And what students can do is essentially match with school psychology programs who didn't necessarily fill their entire cohort after all their acceptance and letters were received, and essentially hopefully secure a placement in a school psychology program. One of the reasons that this program was developed through NASP essentially was to address the shortages in school psychology issue. And so we didn't want spots in programs to go unfilled. And in particular, for students who were interested in becoming school psychologists, it was important to find them places to complete their training as well. So this really is an excellent resource, and I would encourage you to look at it on the NASP website. Okay. So finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about career pathways in school psychology. So as an assistant professor, I know pathways in academia generally better than I know practitioner pathways. And so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about careers in academia, and then I'll move on to talking a little bit about careers in practice as well. So there are many pathways to be taken in academia. I think oftentimes the traditional pathway that students are exposed to is essentially this very research intensive type of position, when in reality, faculty positions are very diverse. There are research focused positions, clinically focused positions, then there are teaching focused positions, and in many cases, there are positions that represent combinations of those types of foci. So for example, positions that combine teaching and a clinical focus. And so I want to talk a little bit about ways essentially to be successful in those types of positions. Okay. So in terms of securing your first academic job, many of my graduate students ask me, well, what essentially should I be doing in my first several years or even in my later years to make sure that I'm set up for a career in academia? Here are some pieces of advice that I have for you that really come from my own personal experiences, but also just come from reading literature on how essentially to be successful in academia, how to be a productive scholar, and really just how to perform well in the tenure and promotion process. One thing that I would recommend is to seek multiple mentors. So in particular, you want to look for mentors within your program as well as mentors external to your program. By connecting with multiple mentors in your program, a lot of times you can get your hands into multiple research projects, which essentially allows you to stay productive and to build up the number of publications you would need to have to become an academic school psychologist. Mentors external to the program, so for example, mentors you find through the American Psychological Association or through the National Association of School Psychologists, can also be really wonderful resources, partly because in many cases, they can connect you with other colleagues who might have similar interests. And so having mentors, I think, internally and externally is really key. Many students, if you kind of look in the literature about what makes a successful faculty member, many of them talk a little bit about having mentors for different purposes. So for example, some of their mentors were really, really productive scholars and really helped enhance their productivity, enhance their scholarship. Others were able to help facilitate professional connections for them. And others were really there to talk to them a lot about work-life balance and essentially how to be productive in a faculty position, but also to maintain career satisfaction and to maintain a particular work-life balance. And so having mentors for different purposes can be very helpful to you. Another thing I encourage my students to do is write. There are so many student outlets out there that really are looking for publications in a variety of areas. And so I've listed some in particular to undergraduates and then some in particular to school psychology outlets. So for example, Ion Psychi is Psychi's national publication that often has publications from undergraduate students in it. The NASP Communique is the National Association of School Psychologists newsletter. And what it does is it has a student connections section that essentially solicits contributions from students about their experiences in school psychology or in anything that would be related to the profession. In Division 16 specifically, the Student Association for School Psychologists has a publication called From Science to Practice to Policy, which essentially solicits student contributions as well. Another thing, so if you might say to yourself, well, I really don't have time to write. And that's a very common issue for undergraduates and graduate students who can really be so busy and are doing so many things. One thing I would encourage you to do is think to the greatest extent possible how you can incorporate what you're doing in your coursework with what you can do in terms of things that you can publish. So for example, do you have a course assignment that would allow you to research a topic that may ultimately lead to a publishable product? Have you done a course assignment in the past that you can see developing further into something that's a course product? And the more you integrate your responsibilities in terms of your coursework, your service, and then other responsibilities you might have in the program, the more productive you're likely to be. I would highly recommend while you're in graduate school securing some type of teaching experience. Most academic positions, although they may emphasize research to a very large extent, do typically want to see that you have some type of teaching experience. And so sometimes finding ways to secure your funding by having teaching assistantships and other types of positions working with students can be a really excellent way to demonstrate that you would be a qualified professor. I also encourage students, and many of them don't know this, that there are opportunities to be involved in editorial work even before you have an academic position. For example, on some editorial boards, the editor will allow students to complete reviews of journal articles if they're doing it under the supervision of an editorial board member or somebody who's considered an expert reviewer. And so if you do have time, do ask your professor or your advisor if there are opportunities to work on some of those reviews with them so that you do get some experience with the review process, and then you do get exposure to some of the research that really is just almost emerging imminently. I would highly encourage you to get involved in professional organizations. It's a lot of fun, in addition to being an excellent way really to network and to identify colleagues who share similar interests. And one thing I also like to do as well is I tend to look at the CVs of other individuals who I admire. So for example, if there are more advanced scholars, even early career scholars who I think have done some really excellent work, sometimes I'll look on their CVs to see where are they publishing, what are the types of service they're involved in, and essentially what are some ways essentially that I can mirror this pathway. Okay. So once in the academic job, you might say, okay, well, what can I do essentially to ensure that I'm successful in this position? Some things that I think are really valuable to do, for example, are integrating service and scholarship to the greatest extent possible. So in many cases, for example, like serving on an editorial board, or even serving as an ad hoc reviewer for a journal, can allow you essentially some time to review scholarship that's relevant to your research agenda, which in the end may give you some ideas and may make you more productive in terms of your own research work. I try to identify mentors within and outside of my institution. Mentors in the institution can give you lots of valuable information about how to be successful in that particular environment. And then mentors outside of the institution often can give you advice on how to be successful in your particular field and essentially what the profession is looking for. It's important. I know you can be very, very busy once you start an academic position, but to constantly be investing in your own professional development when you can. So for example, going to stats boot camps, engaging or participating in grant writing workshops is really important. Again, it can be hard to find time to do these things, but in the end, they're the kinds of tools that will allow you to pursue the research agenda that you want to pursue. And then finally, I just want to point out, there was a study fairly recently, a number of years ago, by Martinez, Floyd, and Erickson in the Journal of School Psychology. And in particular, it looked at the behaviors of highly successful and highly productive faculty members. And the goal of the article was to interview these faculty members to give some recommendations about what really makes a productive scholar. Some of the recommendations that came out of this study were, for example, really getting to know the journals in your field, getting to know the journals outside of your field that typically publish in school psychology or publish in a related field, and then understanding essentially what the fit of your research is for those journals and the intended audience. Knowing the journals can be a really, really important part of being able to publish in a particular profession. Get a mentor and be a mentor. And so we've talked a little bit about this already. Obviously, mentorship is really key. Becoming a mentor can be really valuable too, because in many cases, I've had students bring excellent ideas into my lab, and things that they really have gone very far with them, have really just developed them very independently. And having opportunities to collaborate essentially has made me a better scholar and made me more productive. And so being a mentor as well, and having opportunities for your students to publish is a really excellent way to stay on top of your work. Setting and prioritizing writing time is a very, very difficult thing to do, but a very important thing. I've had colleagues tell me about lots of different strategies they use. So for example, setting aside time in the morning before they check email, setting aside time in the evening, figuring out essentially the best time and the time that you are most productive, and finding a time really to get that research done is huge. Pursuing a systematic line of research can be big, essentially cultivating expertise in one particular area. So essentially that when you're building your research agenda, you have expertise in one area, and you might be the person that somebody turns to on a particular area, whether it's on an editorial board or somewhere else. And then becoming a journal reviewer and taking the reviews you receive seriously. I think sometimes it can be easy to be frustrated when you do get reviews, and in particular when you don't necessarily get a favorable decision on an article that you submit. But the reviews can be really, really valuable pieces of information about how to improve your research, and how to improve the methodology of your studies. And so taking those reviews very seriously, and then also reviewing other articles, can give you ideas about how to improve your scholarship. Okay, so now I just want to talk very briefly about pathways in practice. And again, I am not a practitioner. I'm a professor, and so I can tell you a little bit about what the options are, but I will ultimately have to refer you to some other resources to get a better idea of how to be a successful practitioner. But I just wanted to show you at least the range of settings in which practitioners do work. And so as you'll see, school psychologists really work primarily in the public schools, in the K-12 public schools. And so about 86% of those practitioners are employed in those settings. Beyond the public schools, though, you'll see that school psychologists really are employed in many settings, and settings often that you would see other types of psychologists employed in. So for example, we have some school psychologists employed in clinics and hospitals, some in private practice, some in private schools. We have a smaller percentage who serve as faculty members. And one thing I do want to point out about this slide is that you'll notice that, of course, a large number of individuals serve in public schools, and that's partly because in order to serve in settings other than the K-12, essentially you need a doctoral degree to practice. And only about 25% of our practitioners have a doctoral degree, meaning that there naturally is going to be a small number of individuals who are employed in settings like clinics and hospitals or colleges and universities. But it is very common for doctoral level school psychologists to go into these types of settings. Okay, so here are some additional resources for practitioners. And so, for example, the NASP communique, which I brought up earlier, is the newsletter for the National Association of School Psychologists, and it often has really great up-to-date resources about topical issues happening in school psychology and essentially how to apply best practices to your work. The Find a Mentor program through the National Association of School Psychologists is something that I'll show you the screen for in a minute, but essentially is a great way to connect with somebody else around the country who also works in schools and who may share your professional interests. And then finally, the Early Career Resources tab under the Division 16 Early Career website has some really excellent resources for individuals who are interested in practice. So for example, and I have the website listed right here, I'm pointing to it. They have articles on starting a private practice, how to pass the EPPP, securing licensure, and a variety of other issues that are relevant to individuals who are interested in practicing in a variety of settings. Okay, this is the Find a Mentor program that I had mentioned previously. It essentially is a program that links school psychologists, early career school psychologists with other school psychologists who have a variety of areas of expertise. So you'll notice if you log onto the site, you can actually see a list essentially of who the mentors are, as well as their locations and then their areas of expertise. And what you can do is essentially request more info and request to be put in touch with this individual and hopefully form even a long distance mentoring relationship. Okay. And finally, the last resource I want to show you too is a faculty mentoring opportunity through APA Division 16. And in particular, this is a directory of graduate faculty who are interested in mentoring on topics related to cultural and diversity in school psychology. And so many of these faculty have interest in working with underrepresented populations, in finding ways to increase diversity in the field. And all of their contact information is listed on this site, and you can actually search mentors by keywords. So if you're interested in finding faculty who have interest in multicultural issues specifically, this is a great resource to be able to look up faculty members. And all of these individuals have are aware that others might contact them and have agreed and shown interest in mentoring others. Okay, so I've listed my contact information here. If you have any questions about the practice of school psychology, careers in academia, anything that I mentioned today, I would be more than happy to correspond with you over email or correspond over the phone and talk to you about some of these issues and answer your questions. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I really do love being in touch with students, and I hope that I can be helpful to you in some way. So thank you very much. Thank you to Division 45, and thank you to all the students who are watching this. I really appreciate it, and I do hope to hear from you.